I was talking to my lawyers. They said something to me. I can't believe it. Did you really find $1 million in the trunk of a car and turn it in? Did you do that? You did that for real, huh? My man. Good for you. You know Johnny Law got it though, right?
Maybe.
Ain't no maybe about it, Mr. Richie. You know he got it. You turned that money in, he took it, and you ain't get nothing for it, did you? Why you do that?
It was the right thing to do.
Oh, that's true. That's a good answer. It was the right thing to do. The question I've been asking myself is, would you do it again? I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a long time ago. Many car payments ago, many child support payments ago. So I said to myself, the only way to find out is to find out.
Bribery, extortion, murder, racketeering.
You give me an address, I'll make sure the car's there, I'll make sure that money's in that trunk.
No thanks.
You sure? Come on now, Richie, what you think that impresses me, huh? You think that you better than them? You ain't no better than none of them other cops. In fact, you the same as them. You are them. Let me ask you this. Do you really think that putting me behind bars is gonna change anything on them streets? Them dope fiends are gonna shoot it, they're gonna steal from it, they're gonna die for it. Putting me in or out ain't gonna change one thing.
And that's the way it is.
That's just the way it is. So what we got, Richie? We got me and you sitting here. You got that little snitch ass driver for my brother. You got a little bit of powder. You're gonna need more than that, Richie.
I got possession, supply, conspiracy, bribing a law officer. I got people who attest to seeing you kill in cold blood. I got your offshore bank accounts, your real estate, your businesses, all bought with money from heroin. And I got hundreds of parents of dead kids, addicts who OD'd on your product, and that's my story for the jury. That's how I make it all stick. This man murdered thousands of people, and he did it from a penthouse driving a Lincoln. Aside from that, you got nothing to worry about.
That's pretty good, but that's why we go to court, isn't it, Richie? Because I got witnesses too. I got celebrities, I got sports figures, I got Harlem, Richie. I took care of Harlem, so Harlem's gonna take care of me, you can believe that.
And speaking of corruption, we first need to learn about political machines. These are organized groups within a political party that cooperate to control cities, to run them like little kingdoms. How can you do that within a democracy? I thought the point of our country is that the people control. That's what Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address. Of the people, by the people, for the people. But then if you happen to come across a political cartoon on your test, maybe you saw where it said, of the monopolist, by the monopolist, for the monopolist. And that cartoon was a critic of the time that we're talking about, where monopolies were controlling politics, where people were so wealthy they were buying elections. But how could they do that? Well, number one, these political machines could give services to voters. Sometime you need to watch a movie if you're into the mob or you're into cop shows. American Gangster's one of my favorites, starring Denzel Washington. It's a true story of a mobster in Harlem who was involved in the alcohol trade during Prohibition and got involved in the heroin trade once alcohol was legalized. He ran the ghetto of Harlem as if it was his own kingdom. And that's certainly not an isolated incident. You know, Al Capone ran Chicago, Pablo Escobar ran the country of Colombia for a time, Roger Taney ran the city of New York. But how did these men do that? Well, number one, they would buy the loyalty of voters by giving them services. They would offer financial support for businesses, making businesses and voters and people dependent on these individuals or these groups. After the Civil War, machines using these methods could gain control of major cities. These were extremely well organized. The precinct captain in charge of each local precinct would often guarantee voters by, again, ensuring they would come out, by giving them services, by making them loyal through codependency. Ward bosses, like the one you saw in Far and Away, the Tom Cruise Nicole Kidman movie, could run precincts by helping immigrants get jobs, get housing, etc. But then at the top was the city boss. And there's tons of movies about these individuals, but more importantly, they were able to bypass the democratic system through very corrupt means. Now, the political boss might be the mayor of the city, might simply be the controlling member of that particular party. As boss, they could control access to city jobs. If you were going to work in that city, you had to go through this individual. So obviously that would give them a lot of power. They would control business licenses. If you're into the Marvel superhero Netflix originals, Kingpin is a great example of a city boss. He was controlling so many aspects of the city. The courts, the police were on his payroll. Businesses had to pay protection fees. That's the type of people these bosses were. They could influence the courts to keep their people out of trouble, whether through bribes or even threats. For example, Pablo Escobar, the man who pioneered the cocaine trade into the United States in the 1980s, threatened even members of the nation's Supreme Court and had them killed when they didn't cooperate. And so they could use fear, they could use finance, but more importantly, they would control these cities. In the United States, they could control municipal agencies, public services, the police. They would arrange building projects, community services. And these bosses would receive a form of taxation. They would be paid by businesses, whether in the form of protection money or insurance, or in some cases they would even be in charge of the public funds. They would get voters' loyalty through giving gifts, and they would use these gifts to extend their influence. Now, many immigrants found themselves caught up in this process because, of course, immigrants coming off of the boat had no resources. You know, Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, when her spoons were stolen, that's all she had. That was her savings. She had stolen those from her family. She was going to try to sell those to a pawn shop to get enough money to get started here. And when those were stolen, she had nothing. And so if you watch the movie, Tom Cruise actually goes to work for one of these ward bosses. He proves that he can fight, and so the ward boss makes him a thug. And he winds up having to be part of this machine that threatens and beats up and intimidates people. Many of these bosses themselves were first or second generation immigrants. And they would help immigrants get homes, get citizenship, get jobs. And in return, these immigrants owed them loyalty. This political cartoon, in fact, one of the beauties of our country is that we do have freedom of expression. We do have freedom of the press. And there were journalists that, despite threats, despite intimidation, continued to expose these people. In fact, if you watch American Gangster, the true story of the man who ran Harlem, New York, a Washington Post reporter played by Russell Crowe would not leave him alone. And it was a reporter who exposed much of the corruption. In fact, in this case, in Roger Taney, the man who ran New York as a king, was exposed by a cartoonist, Thomas Nast, who drew many cartoons like this. Now, the machines would use electoral fraud to win elections. There was a case of this near where I grew up in Polk County, Tennessee, where the local ward boss attempted to steal the election. And this was not hearsay or corruption. No, they literally stole the voting ballot boxes, and they were going to manipulate the results. And so they would use fraud like this. They would also use graft. Graft is an illegal use of political influence for personal gain. You know, this would be if I were to use my limited influence to say, hey, if you wash my car, you know, you won't have to do your next essay. That would obviously be unethical, but I bet I could talk somebody into it. It's certainly unethical. It's definitely illegal. I could be fired for it. But I bet I could convince somebody to keep their mouth shut and go wash my car to not have to do your essay. Obviously, that's immoral. But that would certainly be an illegal use. Now, I don't have that much power, right? But imagine if I did. And imagine if I were corrupt and I were interested in getting a kickback. And there are plenty of people. You know, machines would take kickbacks, and they would accept bribes, and they would often allow illegal activities. In fact, they were often caught up in many of these illegal activities. And this corruption is widespread. I mean, think of the credit mobiler scheme, where the fake construction company was formed to overbid on projects. When that corruption was found out, Carly, the President of the United States was implicated, though he was never proven to have been involved in that scheme. But I mean, think about it. Even the President was perhaps bought off allegedly. The most famous case of corruption in the United States is William Tweed in 1868, known as Boss Tweed. He ran the city of New York. His organization was called Tammany Hall, and he led the Tweed Ring. In running the city, he defrauded the taxpayers of millions of dollars. Of course, in today's money, we're thinking billions of dollars. And he was running the city as a king for years. And yes, people, I'm sure, understood what he was doing, but no one had proof, and really no one had the power or the influence to bring him down. But this is one of those stories where sometimes it makes me want to be a journalist. You know, I just love it that there are people who are brave enough to expose bullies like this. In this case, it was a cartoonist. Old Thomas Nast brought down the Tweed Ring with a series of cartoons. And so the next clip I've got goes into a little bit about Thomas Nast, and then I've got a few examples of his cartoons to show you.
The gangs.
Now, those plug uglies and rabbits in the video we're talking about were gangs. They were groups of immigrants that banded together for protection, and they represented their entire ethnic group in these particular cities. And a great movie to watch if you think this corruption is fascinating, or if really you just don't believe me and you want to see it for yourself. Gangs in New York, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Daniel Day-Lewis. Amazing film about some of these early gangs that ran their particular cities. And it does have Boss Tweed in it. I believe he was played by or represented by Daniel Day-Lewis. Anyway, here's one of Thomas Nast's cartoons. This one's called The Tammany Tiger Breaks Loose. And here you see a Roman Colosseum, the tiger representing Tammany, and he's devouring Lady Liberty. Another way these bosses would gain control is through patronage. Be careful of people who give you extravagant gifts. There's an old saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Be careful when people shower you with gifts, because they're often seeking to win influence. And that's called patronage. Patronage means that you begin to shower someone with gifts, and you win their affection through really a form of bribery. But it's not overt bribery. I'm not saying, Wesley, I'll give you an extra orange juice if you do this. Well, that's obvious bribery. Patronage is where I would say, Wesley, I got you an orange juice today. And then tomorrow, here's a donut. What's this for? Oh, no, I just wanted to give you a donut. Okay. Hey Chase, I brought you, I heard you like Hershey's chocolates, so here you go. What's this for? Well, nothing, and I just do that a little bit each day. With, handful of you throughout the day. Hey, here's I heard you like Snickers, Jenny, here you go. And then before you know it, you're just starting to come in. It's almost like Pavlov's dog. You start coming in and thinking, hey, what's he going to give me today? Oh, cool, Hey, and then one day you walk in, and I don't have anything for you. And so Seth walks in, he's expecting something, but I'm like, here, Emily, I heard you liked Three Musketeers, so here you go. But Seth didn't get anything today. And Seth begins to think, what did I do? Why didn't I get a piece of candy, but Emily did? That's patronage. You see, it's a form of manipulation. So be careful when people give you gifts, especially when it happens often. I have a friend who's a sales rep, and it's just his nature. He gives out his product. Every time we go paddling, he's like, here, guys, anybody want some free samples? And it's a form of advertising. Well, he's good at his job. All he does is anywhere we go somewhere, he's just said, hey, I've got this whole box of samples. Anybody? And people are like, well, okay. Well, really, he's advertising his product and building his business. In this case, jobs were the patronage. Hey, Jordan, I hear that you're good at legal services. I heard you did well on the bar exam. I can hook you up. That's a big one, right? That's not a Three Musketeers. That's a career. But Jordan knows if he's going to get that legal job, he's got to come through me. And he knows that in order to keep his job, he needs to keep me happy. Again, watch The Godfather. If you don't believe me, this stuff's real, and it was going on. Civil service jobs, that means government positions in many cities in America, had gotten so corrupt that they were all patronage jobs. All. I mean, that's unfathomable that our country had become so corrupt at that point. Now, many of these appointees are not qualified. Jordan hasn't passed the bar exam. Maybe he will someday. But let's be honest, that's probably 5-10 years away. But again, if it's my job to give, I can give it to him. Now, that type of system is not a merit-based system. He didn't earn that job. He got hooked up because of who his dad is or etc. And of course, I'm giving that influence. I'm using that influence for my personal gain because now Jordan owes me big time. And many reformers are going to try to fix this system. Because let's be honest, if I hook up Jordan with a job in law, you're not going to want him to represent you if he hasn't passed the bar exam. If he hasn't proved the most basic competency, then you don't want him as your lawyer. But he's your lawyer because I hooked him up. And that's a corrupt system. That's not a good system. But again, that's the way some things are. And so reformers are going to try to press to create a merit-based system. It's a big slide, lots of information. In fact, I think I've got new personal record, maybe 4 presidents on one slide. And there's a reason why 4 presidents on one slide. Because some of these individuals are going to try to go up against the corruption. Most of them will fail. Some of them will be bought off. So let's run through the list. Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president in 1876, and perhaps the most corrupt election in American history. That was the one where he lost to Samuel J. Tilden by the popular vote, but through a secret deal with party leaders, Reconstruction came to an end, and Rutherford B. Hayes became president. And so he's already starting out with a very bad reputation. A lot of people are saying this is so messed up. And I would agree with them. However, perhaps in an attempt to clean up his name, perhaps in an attempt to reform the government that he is now running, he named several independents to the cabinet, and he created a presidential commission to investigate corruption in the United States. In fact, this commission revealed that many top officials in our government were accepting bribes from political machines, and that our government wasn't even responsive to voters, that democracy was failing. I mean, this commission reported and said, hey, guess what? We all knew it was true, but now we have proof our government is not even a democracy. Congratulations. It's messed up. And so Hayes responded by firing 2 of these corrupt officials, hoping to make an example. And this angered many of the stalwarts within his party. The stalwarts were the kind of corrupt machine base. So the Republican Party turned away from Rutherford B. Hayes because he didn't play by the rules. And they appointed James Garfield. And Chester A. Arthur was appointed as Garfield's vice president. Meanwhile, Garfield. So Hayes was made an example of. He didn't follow the rules. He tried to end corruption, and the Republican Party turned their backs on him and did not appoint an incumbent president for re-election. I mean, that's just messed up. Why? Well, because he tried to break the corruption. So the next guy they picked, James Garfield, did the same thing as Hayes. In fact, in some cases, he was giving jobs to reformers to try to fix the system. Now, one of these jobs that he gave to a reformer, he didn't give to the man who had been promised that job. So the man who was expecting the hookup, who had done the favors, who had done the dirty work to get that job, was turned down. They killed him for it. A president of the United States was murdered, assassinated, because he didn't obey the mob. I mean, how messed up is that? This is where we are as a country in 1880. Of course, president dies, vice president takes over. Chester A. Arthur, at this point, is having to deal with a country that just lost its president because the president was trying to clean up corruption. I mean, again, like, the mob movies are often based on true stories. I'm watching Narcos right now. It's kind of dark and very violent and disturbing to watch, in fact. And it's a true story. A man ran for president in Colombia promising to end the cocaine trade and break up the mafia there. And they killed him as he was going to accept the results of the election. And his successor, when they appointed, hey, you're going to run, he was like, oh man, not me. They're going to kill me. And just in the process of running, there were several attempts on his life, including a suicide bomber on a plane. And it's just, I'm like, this is too disturbing to be true, but it is. These things do go on. So Vice President Chester A. Arthur urged Congress to pass a civil service law. And Congress finally did. It was called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This means that appointees for government jobs would have to first pass a standardized exam. Now, this doesn't fix corruption because, for example, if you've got somebody going for a government position versus someone else going for a government position, assuming they both pass the test, you can still use patronage and you can still hook up someone, assuming they both pass the test. But at least this is designed to say that they have passed some measure of competency. And even more precedents. Because again, this is not a simple fix, guys. Corruption is something we all have to address. It's something that we all have to care about, that we all have to be involved in, to stop, to expose. Well, what are these? Why are they buying governments? Why invest so much money into paying off politicians? Well, one of the goals of many of these big businesses were high tariffs. Because high tariffs would guarantee that foreign products coming in were too expensive to sell. And so the monopolists could control industries within the United States. The Democratic Party at this time was really trying to clean up much of this corruption. They were pushing for low tariffs, which would open up our country to international competition, which the Rockefellers and Carnegies could not control, and would hopefully drive down prices and fix at least some of this corruption. In 1884, the voters finally got involved and elected, for the first time since before the Civil War, a Democratic president, Grover Cleveland. And so Cleveland won. And people were cheering. They were like, finally, we've got somebody who's going to clean up this corruption, who's not embedded within the corrupt Republican Party of that time. And he won. But it's kind of like Don Quixote. He won, but he can't beat the system by himself. He wasn't able to lower these tariffs. And in fact, in the next election, his opponents, the mob, had besmirched his reputation enough that he wasn't elected. And so Benjamin Harrison became president. He supported higher tariffs. In fact, under his leadership, the McKinley Tariff Act was signed into law. Yet once again, the voters come back and say, enough is enough, this corruption has to stop. And Grover Cleveland makes one of the only comebacks in presidential history. I think he is the only president ever to have lost re-election and yet come back to win in the next one. So Cleveland was re-elected, supported a bill that lowered the McKinley tariff. He also rejected a bill that created the income tax. But the problem was, and really and I'm simplifying here because there were many goals of the mob or the stalwarts or whatever you want to call them. Tariffs was one of the common goals, however, because tariffs allowed monopolies control. And eventually it's going to go over to the Republican William McKinley again. Once again, high tariffs.
The roots of the Progressive Era reforms began many years earlier. For over 80 years, presidents and federal politicians had rewarded their supporters with lucrative government jobs. It was called patronage, or the spoils system, from an old war slogan. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the American public grew increasingly disgusted with government corruption and favoritism. Some members of the Republican Party began a reform movement. Nicknamed mugwumps, they were influential Republicans who refused to support their party's presidential candidate, who they believed opposed reform. With the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by Charles Guiteau, whom he had refused to hire for a government position, the outcry for an end to patronage reached a crescendo. Now President Charles A. Arthur convinced Congress to pass the Pendleton Act, establishing a federal civil service. Federal workers would now be hired based on competitive exams rather than political influence. Slowly, civil service regulations were expanded to almost all government jobs. The mugwump concept of an honest government based on merit laid the groundwork for progressive reform, as did two other political groups, the Populists and the Socialists. After the Civil War, many Americans returned to or began farming. But over the next decades, there was an overproduction of farm goods. With more supply than demand, prices plummeted lower and lower. At the same time, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and railroad transportation increased, leaving more and more farmers little money to support their families and still pay their debts to bankers. In protest, farmers began to organize political parties. Of them, the Populist Party emerged as the most powerful. The Populists supported an income tax based on earnings to support the government, rather than the tariffs then charged to farmers and businesses. They demanded a shorter workday, government loans to farmers, the direct election of state senators, secret ballot voting, and other election reforms. But Republican William McKinley defeated the populist-supported presidential candidate, Democrat William Jennings Bryan, in 1896, and the Populist Party, if not its causes, faded.
"You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," said the Bible-quoting speaker William Jennings Bryan. The famous speech was ridiculed by some, but among the farmers whose lives were made difficult by the government's tight money policies, Bryan was a hero. He was the self-appointed spokesperson for common people. Their support won him the Democratic nomination for president in 1900. He ran against incumbent President William McKinley. Bryan was determined to carry forward the ideals of the Populist Party, founded by activists for farmers and laborers in Nebraska. He backed the Free Silver movement and the use of the secret ballot in elections. Although Bryan campaigned and spoke enthusiastically, he lost. Still, neither his energy nor his voice gave out through this and two more unsuccessful presidential election campaigns. Finally, Bryan supported Woodrow Wilson, who offered him the post of Secretary of State. When he lost the position for his pacifist views, it seemed his career was over. Then, in 1925, Bryan was brought back into the public eye. He volunteered to be on the prosecution team to argue against Clarence Darrow over Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. This was the famous monkey trial, in which biology teacher John Scopes was brought to court for teaching Darwin's theory of evolution to his class. In a surprise move, Darrow called Bryan to the witness stand as a biblical scholar to refute Darwin's assumptions and defend the idea that man is not descended from a lower species. Using the questioning tactics for which he was famous, agnostic Darrow hammered away at Bryan's fundamentalist beliefs. There was more at stake here than the fate of a small-town teacher. Darrow believed himself to be fighting for the future of science and education. When he finally trapped Bryan in his own inconsistency, Darrow had won the day. Even though John Scopes was convicted and fined $100, the confrontation was widely considered a crushing intellectual defeat for Bryan, who was made to look like a champion of backcountry ignorance. Even Bryan's partial triumph in winning the case was soon taken from him. The Scopes conviction was overturned on a technicality by the Tennessee Supreme Court. The renowned statesman and public speaker had given his all to this humiliating public appearance. 5 days after the trial, William Jennings Bryan was dead.
The time has arrived for this great nation of ours to step out upon the world stage. So let the spotlight fall on us. I am reminded today of the words of George Washington, who said, "To be prepared for war is the most effectual means to promote the peace." We ask for a great navy because no national life is worth having if we are not willing to defend it. All the great masterful races have been fighting races. And to lose the fighting virtues is to lose the right to stand at all. There are higher things in life than the soft enjoyment of material comforts. And it is through strife and the readiness for strife that a man or a nation must win greatness. So let the world know that we are here and willing to pour out our blood, our treasure, our tears, and that America is ready, and if need be, desirous of battle.
But first off, what do we mean when we talk about imperialism? Imperialism is the policy of extending control over weaker nations. Extending control over weaker nations. Another form of this word is empire. We're going to be talking about the formation of the American empire in honor of the recent Star Wars movie. Now, in the 1800s, the Europeans had divided up most of Africa. Remember, we talked about how the triangle trade led to the importation of African slaves into the Americas. Africa, the largest landmass in the world, had been conquered and divided and colonized by European countries. Europeans were also competing for influence in China. China, unlike Africa, however, was an ancient and united people, one of the world's oldest civilizations, and so Europe found it more difficult to exploit China in the way they had exploited Africa. Japan was also a part of this race for colonial influence. In fact, the United States decided to expand overseas for this very reason, that these European powers were doing so, and if we wanted to protect ourselves, we had to be powerful also. And speaking to that very point, if we wanted to be powerful militarily, we had to have a strong military. President Theodore Roosevelt there quoted President George Washington when he said, and I quote, "To be prepared for war is the most effectual means of promoting the peace." So to be prepared for war, Admiral of the U.S. Navy, Captain Rick Martinez, I'm just kidding, Alfred Mahan, urged the United States to build up our naval forces. He believed that we should have the world's third largest navy. He felt that if we were in this position, we could not only defend our borders, but we could advance our interest, protect our business interest abroad, defend our borders, and even expand our influence into other countries. And so we did. We built up the world's third largest naval power, behind only Great Britain and, surprisingly, Germany. And we'll come back to that point when we get to the First World War. Germany also was in an arms race to build up its military and naval forces for aggressive purposes. What are the benefits, aside from defense, of having a strong military and an aggressive policy? There's a commercial benefit. You see, United States factories at this time, we had undergone the Industrial Revolution. We had the capacity to produce far more food and manufacturing products than we actually needed. And this can actually be an economic problem, because in a competitive market, there's a reason, an economic benefit to producing more. The more you make, the more you sell, the more money you make. But there's also a trade-off there, because the more you make, according to the laws of supply and demand, the lower the price of that product becomes. And so overproduction can be a dangerous factor for an economy. And so the United States was swelling economically, and it needed new markets. We also needed raw materials. You see, when you look at the early 1900s, it was also known as the logging era. Because when you walk around, when you go to Pisgah Forest, and you go to the Green River Game Lands, beautiful places, you won't find many old-growth forest left in the United States. Most of the trees out here are younger than 70 years old. Why? Because we cut almost all of them down. We needed a new source for raw materials, because we cannot continue to consume our raw materials at that same rate. So why cut ours down when we can get trees from other countries? Foreign trade was seen as the solution to overproduction. It would create jobs and stimulate the economy. And next, we have to understand that we are talking about a very racist people at this time. Americans viewed themselves as culturally superior to other peoples, morally superior even. This is also a time known as the missionary era, where missionaries were going out to the world to spread Christianity. And with them were coming soldiers and business people. In fact, our colonial efforts in Hawaii began with missionaries. Our colonial efforts in the Philippines began with missionaries, where they would go to teach religion, and they would be quickly followed by soldiers. Along with Columbus and Cortez came missionaries. And so as people were spreading our culture, they were arguing that we had this moral imperative, called the Great Commission, if you will. And at the very end of the book of Matthew in the Gospels, it talks about a commission to go out to the world and spread Christianity. And many felt they had this duty to go out into the world. But again, with them came soldiers. That's why we began the process of taking over Hawaii. And with religion, people also felt that we had the duty to, quote, civilize these peoples. And so now we've outlined the reasons why Americans felt that we needed to expand. Commercial, defense, cultural. And now let's begin to outline some of the early expansion efforts. We'll begin with Alaska. Now, Alaska wasn't necessarily a colonial acquisition, as much as it was a purchase. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward, under President Abraham Lincoln and then Johnson when Lincoln was assassinated, arranged for the purchase of the territory of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. It's quite a deal when you think about it. Alaska is nearly the size of the southeastern United States. At this time, it was called Seward's Folly. People criticized the Secretary of State, saying, what on earth are we going to do with this huge tract of land that's not even connected to the contiguous United States? What do we need this land for? How do we even access it? They called it Seward's Icebox, saying it's frozen over half the year. How do we even get out there? However, I think Seward's brilliance has been proven over time. Alaska is a land rich in resources. There's a pipeline coming from Alaska carrying oil every day, continuously running, night and day, to the lower 48. Alaska is rich in timber and minerals. It is also quite beautiful, containing some of the only remaining glaciers in the United States. And it is enormous and sparsely populated. In fact, the U.S. government will pay you money to live in Alaska because they are still trying to settle that area, which is so sparsely populated today. So if all else fails in life, move to Alaska. But this map outlines why they were calling it Seward's Folly. You can see how far away Alaska is from the United States. I don't know if you ever watched the show Ice Road Truckers, but a lot of those series, a lot of those stories were about trucks trying to make the perilous journey because this road is frozen often throughout the winter. But let's talk about Hawaii. My mom's life dream has been to go to Hawaii, and I'd like to go too someday. Hawaii was once an independent kingdom, ruled by people who migrated there eons past. We have no idea how they really got there. They perhaps discovered it by boat thousands of years ago. But there were an indigenous people when the first Americans discovered the islands of Hawaii in the 1790s. U.S. merchants were stopping off in Hawaii on their way to China and India. Because remember, when the American continent was accidentally discovered in the late 1400s, it was accidentally discovered because Columbus hoped to find a westward route to the Indies, to China and India for trading purposes. And of course, quickly after the United States became a nation, we began to continue the process of sending merchants across the Pacific Ocean over to China and India. Now, of course, at this time, they would have to take a very long, perilous journey all the way around the continent of South America. I mean, that's a long, long journey, all the way around the continent of South America. And so they would often stop off at this set of islands called the Hawaiian Islands. They would stop there to refuel and to rest and to rebuild and then continue on their journey. Now, over time, people would settle in Hawaii and set up shops and provide supplies to these merchants who were making these commercial trips. And by 1875, there were enough Americans living in the Hawaiian Islands, mostly running sugar plantations, the point where the United States recognized these American planters officially in the Hawaiian Islands. And so a treaty allowed Hawaiian sugar from these American planters to be sold in the United States tax-free. So effectively it was a NAFTA or a TPP, a trading deal between the Hawaiian Islands and the United States. And that allowed, while not politically connecting the two places, economically these places were connected. And meanwhile, Americans were moving here throughout the 1820s. Yankee missionaries were founding schools. People were settling. Americans were living on these islands. And really, while Americans made up a small minority of the Hawaiian population, they owned 75% of the island's wealth because they owned these huge sugar plantations. And since they were trading with the United States tax-free, they were making enormous profits off of these. But here's a modern picture of Hawaii, of a protest. Why do you think Hawaiians in this picture are protesting the United States annexation of Hawaii? What do you think the purpose for this protest would be, aside from just, hey, hold these signs so we can take your picture? But I did want you to understand these are indigenous Hawaiians, and they were here before America declared this as a territory. Now, in 1887, the United States pressured Hawaii to allow the construction of a naval base there at Pearl Harbor. I'm sure you've heard of Pearl Harbor. Of course, it's where the United States naval base was bombed to start World War II. This became an important refueling station, not only for the U.S. Navy, but for U.S. merchants as they traveled to China and India. But in 1890, this duty-free status, you see, the duty-free status, this trading deal, began in 1875. It allowed planters to trade with the United States tax-free, as if we were one country. However, that deal fell apart with the McKinley Tariff Act in 1890, and now these Hawaiian planters have to pay a tax to trade with the United States. And so it's because of this tax that these sugar planters requested the United States to annex Hawaii. So really, we acquired Hawaii because some rich white sugar planters didn't want to have to pay their taxes. So back to our picture. Hawaii was a kingdom ruled by the indigenous people who allowed these planters to set up their plantations as long as they agreed to be Hawaiian citizens and obey the Hawaiian laws. But when this tax was imposed upon them and severely hurt their profits, businessmen forced the king of Hawaii, King Kalakau, to only allow those who owned land to vote. Well, much of the land was controlled by these planters, meaning these planters were effectively given power over the Hawaiian Islands. Now, the very last queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, in 1891 tried to remove this requirement and return democracy, or return the power to her people. The U.S. Marines came in to help these business groups overthrow the queen. And a new government was set up, headed by Sanford Dole, which you may recognize his name next time you buy bananas or fruit, which is tropical in nature. Now, the United States President this time is Grover Cleveland, said he could not make Dole surrender power to the Queen, even though the United States military helped instill this person into power. And so the United States formally recognized the Republic of Hawaii, and while the expansionist William McKinley became president, Congress proclaimed Hawaii a U.S. territory. And this was our first real overseas colonial acquisition. Now, I stress overseas because we've already talked about the acquisition of the Mexican territories of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And we've already talked about the forceful acquisitions of the Ohio territories and the southeastern United States and the mountainous regions from the indigenous peoples living here. And everywhere we've expanded, we fought and did so violently. However, Hawaii does represent our first overseas acquisition. Now, Americans have had a long relationship with Cuba. Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Miami. In fact, I'll be taking a cruise passing not too far from there this summer. It's always been a close proximity to the United States, and so we've always had a relationship. Not always a very good relationship, but certainly we've always had a relationship with this area. From 1789, when our country was officially ratified under the U.S. Constitution, until 1898, Cuba was a colony of Spain. However, in the mid-1800s, Cuba was undergoing a revolution, very similar to the American Revolution. The only difference is theirs failed, and Spain remained the imperial power of Cuba. But then a second revolution began in the 1890s. And during this revolution, a famous poet and journalist and writer named Jose Marte was leading the fight for independence. He was charismatic. He was well-spoken. He had attracted quite a following. And he had inspired many Americans. And so really, U.S. public opinion was split. You see, on one side, American business interest supported Cuba's relationship with Spain because Spain represented stability in Cuba. Much like in Iraq, while for many years Iraq was under the leadership of the United States provided a degree of stability for their country. And so American opinion tended to support U.S. involvement in Iraq until more recently. Same principle in Spain. U.S. business interests wanted stability. There were quite a few sugar plantations owned by Americans in Cuba, and so we had a vested interest in seeing Spain's continued rule over Cuba. However, this journalist, Jose Marte, again, charismatic, outspoken, a revolutionary, really attracted many Americans because, well, isn't that what we were all about? Isn't our country based on a revolution? Weren't we fighting for those same ideals of freedom and independence that now Jose Marte is leading in his country? And now to make matters worse, Spain called in their toughest general, General Valeriano, oh, my Spanish is terrible, excuse me, Valeriano Wheeler, was sent to Cuba to restore order. Now, putting down a rebellion is a very difficult task. I don't know if you've seen Star Wars, but it's a very difficult task to put down a rebellion. I mean, you can blow up planets and they still rebel. Seriously. So how do you actually put down a rebellion? Well, number one, what General Wheeler did was to put around 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps. 300,000 Cubans in concentration camps, seriously. Basically, any suspected revolutionary sympathizers would be isolated from the rest of the population. And the purpose here was to quell the rebellion without having to kill all the Cubans by isolating those who were supposedly the, quote, enemy. But the trick in a revolution, in a rebellion, is who is the enemy. Right? In Star Wars New Hope, Vader boards the ship with Princess Leia, and Princess Leia says, I'm not the enemy. I'm a member of the Senate. And now Vader, even Vader, right, like kills everybody with the lightsaber. Vader scratching his head. Well, is she? He says, no, you're part of the Rebel Alliance and you're a traitor. She says, no. Well, how do you know? Well, what did they do? Well, they threw her in jail. They can't just kill her. They don't know for sure, so they have to isolate her. So that's what it means by concentration camps. Well, the bottom line is, when you go around throwing, quote, innocent people in prison, it makes you look bad. And this is where newspapers had a field day. Two newspapers in particular, and you're learning about these in your group project. The New York Herald and the San Francisco Herald, if I remember correctly. New York Post and San Francisco Herald. And one ran by Joseph Pulitzer and the other by William Randolph Hearst. And these two newspaper publishers saw an opportunity. Because I don't know about you, but when I turn on the radio and it's politics as usual, I'm like, whatever, change the channel, put on some music. But when I turn on the radio and I hear about war, you know, no one ever says, there was another war today, blah, 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 8,000 people died. No, they said, it's a war! Everyone's gonna die! Oh my God! What are we gonna do? Pets' heads are falling off! Right? And you're all freaking out, and you're like, oh my God, we're all gonna be drafted. Keith's dead. Oh man, like, what are we gonna do? You know, there's something about a war that excites people. It really does. I hate to say it, but that's just the truth. And I hate to say it this way, but newspapers love it when there's a good war. Why? Because everyone tunes in. You know, just like the election. I mean, God, I was so sick of it. I'm sure you were too. And so many people suddenly became so interested in politics, and now half of those people don't really care anymore. Oh, sure, they'll give it a good lip service for a few months or more. But like New Year's resolutions, don't worry, they won't last. Hate to break it to you. But for most, they won't last. Now, these newspapers saw an opportunity with the growing crisis in Cuba. And they used sensational writing to lure and engage readers. Oh dear, there was fake news in 1898. It's a good thing we don't do that anymore, right? Ha ha ha. Okay. Now, I want you to go back in time about 2 months. Here we are in the midst of the election. People are about to cast their votes. And now the FBI opens up another investigation on the Hillary Clinton campaign. Oh, man, here we go again, right? And then a couple months later, the investigation was actually not really substantial. It led many to question, why did that happen? Why was the news so concentrated on this? Or why was the news so concentrated on this? Or why was the news so concentrated on this? Or on even from the other side, why were there so many allegations into Trump's past? So many, why was there so much dirt being dug up on both sides? Well, for one, it's biased journalism. Perhaps there's money involved. Number two, it just sells. People are going to read about the latest scandal. And this war was certainly fraught with scandal. You see, there was a telegram a letter sent from a Spanish diplomat stationed in Cuba to the Spanish office in the homeland in Spain. It was from a man named Enrique Dupuy de Lome. And in the letter, again, just the opinion of a diplomat, in the letter, it called President of the United States McKinley, weak and a bidder for peace. He said, he's not going to get involved, help out with the rebellion. He's weak. The United States is going to sit this one out. They're not going to help us put down this rebellion. And it was just, again, the opinion of a diplomat. Does not reflect the opinion of the nation of Spain. However, somehow, I guess WikiLeaks was around in 1898. Somehow this got out. I don't know if Russia was involved or whatever. But anyway, somehow it got out. And this was major headline news. Suddenly, the news spun this information, and now Spain is calling us weak. Oh, no, you don't. Oh, no, you don't. You can call us all kinds of things. Dumb, rednecks, hicks, shotgun, pickup truck wielding, whatever. But you don't call us a bunch of cowards. By gosh, we'll start writing country songs. We'll start using those pickup trucks and we'll mount machine guns on them. You don't call us a bunch of cowards. You don't. Because here's what happened. American opinion started turning towards, guess what, the revolutionary cause. And before you know it, President McKinley was calling for a mobilization of volunteers. And here's where things get really messy. We sent a warship to Havana Harbor in Cuba. Now, the official position of the purpose of this warship was to aid in the evacuation of Americans who were residing in Cuba at that time. So we were to help these Americans get off the island because things were getting tense. Then the warship explodes. Oh my God, let me show you the picture.
Oh, wow. It's flying.
Now, let's use truth for a second. Here is a drawing of someone's interpretation of how this explosion looked. The person who drew this picture was not there when it happened. However, this picture was on the front pages of every newspaper around the country. What does this picture make you think happened? That it was attacked, right? That it was a Spanish act of terrorism. Al-Qaeda done be bombing ships in Havana Harbor. Not really Al-Qaeda, but Spain, right? Spain is bombing us. They are using terrorism against us. How dare they? But now let me throw some truth on that story. But what does science know? I mean, come on, seriously. It's not like there's facts or anything casting real doubt on that. That's not what the newspapers were looking at. They were saying terrorism, American blood on American soil. Because technically an American ship is American soil. I mean, anyway. And suddenly we're at war. In fact, okay, after the Dulome letter, Spain apologized. They fired that diplomat. They said he does not reflect Spanish opinion. After the Maine, Spain said, we didn't do that either. Don't freak out, guys. This is not us. We're friends. Remember, we loaned you money during your own revolution. In fact, Spain agreed to all U.S. demands. The United States said, you need to stand down, Spain. We need to conduct an investigation. You need to allow for our inspectors to come on to Havana Harbor to conduct a full investigation. They said, sure, we'll help you. What do you need? We're your friends. But it's too late. Damage is done. The United States declared war in April of 1898. Now, guess what? We had our own reasons. It wasn't just, okay, the newspapers have gotten caught up and, it's all everybody else's fault. American people are just crazy. No. The American government had expressed imperialist intentions in going to war with Spain. In fact, the first battle was nowhere near Cuba. In fact, it was the other side of the world, in Manila, in the Philippines. Why? What is the Philippines? Well, there was another Jose Marte type in the Philippines. His name was Emilio Aguinaldo. And he had approached the United States government and said, if you will help us free our country from Spain, we are going to adopt a constitution just like yours. And we're going to be a country just like yours. And we'll be your best friend over here. Right next to China and Japan, by the way. And we said, sure. But here's the catch. I don't know if you're a Game of Thrones fan. Never invite a stronger person to fight your battles for you. Because they're probably not fighting your battles for you out of the goodness of their heart. They probably have other intentions. And the United States had other intentions when we helped out the Philippines. In fact, sure, we'll push the Spanish out. But what did we actually do? We actually conquered the Philippines. And we made them a colony of the United States, even until the end of the Second World War. Here's the Philippines, by the way, collection of over 1,000 different islands. This was the real win for the United States out of the war with Cuba. So, the war in the Caribbean. Yes, we had intentions in getting involved in Cuba, certainly. We weren't just helping them out of the goodness of our heart either. The United States blockaded Cuba. We surrounded them with our Navy. The Spanish fleet in Santiago de Cuba harbor was completely outnumbered and outgunned, while the Navy was entirely prepared for this scope of campaign. This was exactly what we had built up our Navy for, was naval conquest of small islands for strategic gain. However, the U.S. Army was rather ill-prepared. We had a small professional force, mostly volunteers. McKinley had called for about 120,000 volunteers. Many of these were either very young and weren't even alive when the Civil War happened, or they were very old Civil War veterans, and so too old to be very useful. They were actually ill-prepared and ill-equipped. There were more deaths in this war as the result of food poisoning from really gross meat than there was anything else. More people died of yellow fever even than bullets. And there's really not much to talk about in terms of battles or great, it's not like a Pearl Harbor or a D-Day where it's been forever memorialized. The only real battle worth mentioning was the Battle of San Juan Hill. And even though the war was basically over, it was a strategic hill and it was a Spanish stronghold, but the main reason I even bring it up is because guess who? Teddy Roosevelt led the charge up the hill. And sure, he had political ambitions. The military is a great way to make a name for yourself. I mean, so many of our politicians had long careers in the military, and that helped launch their political career. So when Teddy Roosevelt formed the Rough Riders, and there was even a movie about it, it's not bad. It's not great, but anyway. The end of the movie concludes with this dramatic charge up the hill. Under machine gun fire, under artillery fire, Teddy Roosevelt led the charge. And, probably most of that is true. The guy had nerves of steel. But nonetheless, the war was coming to a quick conclusion. U.S. troops also invaded Puerto Rico. And the Spanish had no interest in going toe-to-toe with the United States. But here's an old painting of the Rough Riders. The war did last long enough for Teddy Roosevelt to pose with this men and say, can you draw a picture of us real quick? That's, again. And here was another artist rendering. I'm sure Teddy Roosevelt paid to have this one drawn as well, because here he's shown as the heroic figure leading the charge up the hill. So the war concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in August of 1898. So it really was a splendid little war. Started in April, done by August. Nice little summer affair for some people. The agreements were not so pleasant. Spain had to relinquish control of Cuba, as well as Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So much of the rest of their Caribbean territories were handed over to the United States, with the addition of the big win in the Philippines for the United States as well. Philippines were sold to the United States. We had promised Emilio Aguinaldo that we would free his people from Spanish misrule. Instead, we purchased his territory and made it a colony of our own. The Treaty of Paris sparked a debate. And I love that quote by Mark Twain where he says, there must be two Americas. One that sets people free, and the other that takes those once freed people and places them back in captivity. Glad we don't do that anymore. Now, McKinley tried to justify the annexation of the Philippines on moral grounds, saying they're a bunch of heathens that need some salvation. But really, let's be honest. We have great commercial interest in the Philippines. It's right next to China, which you'll hear all about in the next section. And so Mark Twain joined a group called the Anti-Imperialist League, saying this is totally messed up what we're doing. Anyway, here's a picture of the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Now, first off, Puerto Rico. During the Spanish-American War, the island was occupied by United States General Nelson Miles. Puerto Rico was placed under military control, and these territories became de facto territories of the United States. In fact, Puerto Rico and Guam, two islands near Cuba, remain territories of the United States. Cuba's story was a little different. People were split. American opinion, Cuban opinion was divided on whether or not Cuba should become a state of the United States. Should they be an independent country? Or should they be a territory with self-government? Because that's what Puerto Rico essentially is. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico has remained and is today a strategic United States post in the Caribbean. We offer Puerto Rico protection of the United States government. Nobody messes with them because we got their backs. But in 1900, when the Foraker Act was passed shortly after the war, Puerto Rico now has a civil government, a civilian government, not a military one, though they were occupied by the U.S. military for a couple of years. Puerto Rico has its own president and now has its own legislature. Though for a time, Puerto Rico had a governor appointed by the President of the United States. But as of 1917, Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And they do have democratic rights to elect their own leaders. So meanwhile, relations between Cuba and the United States. The United States recognized Cuba's independence from Spain officially. In fact, after the war was over, we issued the Teller Amendment, and this stated that the United States had no intention whatsoever of taking over Cuba. While we took over the Philippines, while Puerto Rico and Guam became territories, the selling point for the Spanish-American War was that we were, quote, liberating Cuba. However, after the war was over, the United States occupied Cuba. So though on paper Cuba was independent, in practice we left a strong garrison there. Many of the same rulers in Cuba that were ruling at the time of the Spanish remained in power. So there were very few real changes. In fact, this was often the story of revolutions, not only in South America, but even in the United States. Many of the same leaders that were there when it was a colony continued to be in power. In fact, many Cuban protesters who were protesting the United States treatment or the sham of the whole thing were thrown in prison or even kicked off the island. Meanwhile, the American military government helped to rebuild the country. But I want to point out the irony here. You see, Cuba was undergoing a revolution. But at the end of its revolution, very little actually changed. America underwent a revolution in 1776, right? Paul Revere writing, the redcoats are coming. But what actually changed? Women didn't get the right to vote until much later. African Americans didn't get the right to vote until much later. What actually changed? In fact, many of the people that were ruling the United States prior to independence continued to rule. And the same was true in Cuba. Although, this is what the newspapers were printing, right? The Spanish misrule was leading to anarchy. In fact, the United States required that for Cuba to maintain its independence, they add the Platt Amendment to their Constitution. Now, the Platt Amendment had some important stipulations. Cuba got to be independent, yay. However, they could not pass treaties that allowed foreign control over their land. So, in fact, when Cuba asked the Soviet Union for help in the 1950s, and in the early 1960s when the Soviets placed nuclear missiles in Cuba pointed at the United States, that was a violation of the Platt Amendment. So Cuba would not be allowed to allow foreign countries any control over their land. The United States maintained the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs. So technically the Bay of Pigs invasion, though it was an embarrassment for the CIA, was perfectly legal. And finally, the United States was able to buy or lease land for the Navy, which is Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, which is where we keep suspected terrorists in a military prison, and they have not been held on trial yet. And so we've had people there since 9/11, so for quite some time, who have not been on trial. Yes, a violation of the United States Constitution, but our loophole is we are keeping them outside of United States territory. Effectively, this makes Cuba a protectorate. So again, if you're a Star Wars fan, this is the situation that Cloud City found itself in Empire Strikes Back. They were a protectorate of the empire. They were independent, but if you really know your Star Wars, you remember Lando Calrissian complaining about how they weren't really independent. And then you remember at the end of the movie, Darth Vader said, "I guess I'm going to have to leave a garrison here." Mwahahaha. You know, it's the same principle. Now, the United States wanted to maintain a strong political presence in the Caribbean to protect American businesses there. We had a vested interest in maintaining a presence in the Caribbean. We had a vested commercial interest in maintaining a presence in the Philippines as well as Hawaii. These places all serve to benefit our economy. But they also entangle our military overseas. It's no exaggeration that our motives in the Persian Gulf War were primarily financial. The tiny little state of Kuwait was very important economically to the United States. And so we wrote, "God bless America," and sent 100,000 troops under General Schwarzkopf, and we gave Iraq some freedom. Well, Kuwait some freedom, and Iraq some bombs. Why? Well, for oil. The war was short, lasted 3 days, but the point is, we will use our military to protect our commercial interests. Particularly in the Philippines. And this is, unfortunately, as the video said, a distasteful legacy. Emilio Aguinaldo approached the United States asking for help and learned the nasty lesson that you don't ask a stronger power to fight your battles for you, because they often do so with ulterior motives. When the United States purchased the Philippines from Spain in the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines became a colony of the United States. In fact, the same man who asked us for help wound up leading a fight for independence against the United States, that same Emilio Aguinaldo. And we wound up using the same tactics that the Spanish had used in Cuba that we were calling them butchers for. We placed Cubans into concentration camps, and we were using torture techniques against the Cubans. There were regiments in the southeast brought up on war crimes. In fact, near where I went to school, the very same town, Cookeville, Tennessee, had sent a regiment to fight in the Filipino insurrection. And that very same Cookeville regiment wound up being charged on war crimes. And when they were interviewed in the deposition, they claimed that the Filipinos didn't even look human. They were using very racist terminology to describe these people because Filipinos are very short. They have darker skin, and their language is Tagalog. It's guttural in nature. And so they were using these very racist connotations to justify their treatment of these human beings. And now when I say treatment, let me point out, number one, 21,000 Filipinos lost their lives in putting down this insurrection. 21,000 people were killed by the United States fighting for their independence. But also, we would go into towns, go into villages in the Philippines, and we would torture people in front of the town. And the preferred method of torture was called water torture. And it's not like waterboarding like you've seen today. That's simulated drowning. It's pretty nasty to watch. Water torture is where we would shove a hose into someone's stomach, and we would pump their stomach full of water and then kick them until it hemorrhaged. I have a video to show you later of that, but I'll save it for later in the course.
Let's see it.
Now, the aftermath of the war is that we put down a rebellion. We were the evil empire. I hate to say that. The United States president appointed a governor who appointed an upper house, and people got to elect a lower house, but it's not a very transparent democracy. The Philippines became a protectorate, effectively a colony of the United States, and this situation remained until after the Second World War. On to China. The United States has and continues to have a great interest in China. It is a vast potential market, an investment opportunity. And as such, countries have rushed to gained spheres of influence in China and have often competed for trading rights in this nation. In fact, the United States Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, issued a policy called the Open Door Notes. And these notes were a policy statement asking European nations to share trading rights with the United States. And generally people agreed, saying, okay, this is because China is such a vast market. They have, even at this time, one of the world's largest populations. And so generally people agreed. So the point I want to make here is that China was actually never conquered or became, China was not part of a European empire. It remained independent. It was a powerful nation long before European powers began trading with it. In fact, the Chinese are a very proud people, very nationalistic, very isolationist in themselves. And while Europeans were dominating commercially in China, many Chinese people felt this was harming their culture. And so they began to form secret societies, not unlike the Ku Klux Klan, not unlike these alt-right movements that you've been hearing about. They were called the Boxers. And the Boxers were a Chinese secret society dedicated to preserving Chinese culture. They began to commit acts of terrorism, killing foreigners, killing Chinese converts to Christianity, generally attempting to terrorize Chinese and foreign immigrants into either leaving or retaining their culture. This was called the Boxer Rebellion, where this group attempted a coup in China to take over power. And the United States and European nations sent a coalition of forces to put down the Boxer Rebellion. In fact, this is the only time we have ever fought a war in China on China's soil. Was putting down the Boxer Rebellion. And why? Was to protect our commercial interest. So here's an old drawing of the Boxer Rebellion. The point with this drawing is that you can see flags from many different nations fighting these Boxers. The Secretary of State, John Hay, issued the Open Door Notes to keep trade open. And while China has and continues to be a valuable trading partner, this policy reflects some important beliefs about our economy. And these are based on the theory of mercantilism. Number one, that economic growth depends on exports. That we need to have markets to sell our products to in order to continue to grow economically. It also reflects a policy and a belief that the United States has a right to keep markets open, even by force if necessary. And so really under this theory, the Persian Gulf War was entirely justified. Under this theory, United States involvement in the First World War makes perfect sense. Why did we involve ourselves in the First World War? Well, there wasn't a Holocaust, there wasn't a Hitler, but why did we send 3 million soldiers? Well, Woodrow Wilson said it was to make the world safe for democracy, but is that accurate? Eugene Debs said no. He said that was a lie. In fact, he was thrown in prison for protesting the draft during the First World War. He said it's not right that people are being forced to fight in a war to protect billionaires. That's his statement, not mine. And not protect their safety, but he's saying is to protect their bank accounts because we owed money. But again, it's based on this theory that the United States has a right to keep markets open even by force if necessary. And then the final point is these open door notes reflect the belief that closing of an area to trade threatens the survival of the United States. The closing of an area to trade threatens the survival of the United States.
But aid for Cuba.
Now, as I said before, the Anti-Imperialist League had very prominent people from many different fields. Mark Twain was one of the more famous ones, but there were many people from all various reasons. And they agreed. Generally, the statement of anti-imperialism is that it is wrong to rule others without their consent, that democracy should apply not just to our nation, but to those we involve ourselves with as well.